At 75 years old, Seraphine Duvall learned that her own son saw her the way people see a fraying armchair, something that used to have a place in the room, but no longer fits the aesthetic. Pushed out of the home she had poured 3 years of her life into, told that her time had passed, she was handed a brochure for a senior living facility and expected to go quietly. But instead of packing for Goldenbrook Manor, Seraphine reached for something no one else wanted. A rusted key to a falling-down quilting cabin in the hills of Fennwick Ridge, the kind of property you drive past and assume has been forgotten by everyone, including its owner. They called it worthless. Seraphine called it hers. And hidden inside that cabin, stitched shut inside a quilt that no one had touched in over 40 years, was a secret that would pull historians, collectors, and journalists to her door and leave her son standing on the porch, hat in hand, asking for a second chance he wasn't sure he deserved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Seraphine had moved in with her son Brett 3 years before any of this, in the autumn after her husband Raymond passed. Raymond had been the kind of man who handled things, not because Seraphine couldn't, but because they divided their life together that way over 46 years of marriage. He handled the finances, the car maintenance, the conversations with contractors. She handled everything else, which was most of it. When he died of a heart attack in the driveway on a Tuesday morning in October, Seraphine didn't just lose her husband. She lost the architecture of her daily life. Brett had suggested she move in almost immediately. His house in Harwick was large enough, a 4-bedroom colonial with a finished basement and a yard that his wife Waverly paid a service to maintain. There was a guest room on the main floor with its own bathroom, and it made practical sense. Seraphine wasn't the type to admit she needed help, but she wasn't foolish either. She sold her own house, put most of the proceeds into a joint account she shared with Brett to help cover the additional costs of her presence, and moved in with 2 suitcases and her mother's sewing basket. The first year was fine. Not warm, exactly, but manageable. She cooked 3 evenings a week, kept her room tidy, stayed out of Waverly's way when she was working from home, and tried not to make suggestions about the children's schedules even when she had them. She babysat when asked. She walked to the farmer's market on Saturdays and brought back things nobody had requested, but everyone ate. She made herself small and useful, which she understood to be the bargain. The second year, she noticed the shift. Brett's software company had a strong run, and with the money came changes. They repainted the whole house in tones Seraphine privately thought looked like a dentist's waiting room. They replaced the dining table with a glass one that showed every fingerprint. Waverly hired an interior designer who came through each room with a clipboard and a way of looking at things that included, apparently, looking at Seraphine. The sewing basket disappeared from the sitting room one afternoon. It reappeared in Seraphine's bedroom closet without comment. By the 3rd year, the politeness had thinned to something more transparent. Brett started working from home more often. His office was a corner of the living room, and Seraphine learned quickly that moving through the space during his calls made him tense in a way he tried to hide and didn't quite manage. Waverly began scheduling family dinners on evenings when Seraphine had mentioned wanting to watch something on television. Not out of cruelty, Seraphine didn't think, but out of kind of unconscious rearrangement in which Seraphine's preferences had simply stopped being factored in. She was 75 years old. She moved a little slower than she used to. She asked Brett to repeat himself sometimes because her hearing on the left side had softened. She left her reading glasses in rooms she'd already left, which meant small searches several times a day. None of this was unusual. None of it was alarming. But she could feel how each small thing registered in the house as evidence of something. The conversation happened on a Wednesday morning in March. Brett came into the kitchen while she was finishing her tea and sat down across from her with the specific posture of someone who had rehearsed what they were about to say. He told her that he and Waverly had been discussing their space situation. His business was growing. He needed a proper home office, not just a corner of the living room. The guest room was the most logical conversion. They'd looked into options for her, good ones, a place called Goldenbrook Manor, just 25 minutes away with a studio apartment available, daily activities, meals provided, staff on site around the clock. Seraphine listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she set her cup down. And if I don't want to go to Goldenbrook Manor? Brett's expression shifted just slightly. Mom, you're 75. You shouldn't be worrying about maintaining a living situation. This place has everything you need. I have everything I need here. That's not really the point. He was choosing his words carefully, which somehow made it worse. Waverly and I need room to run our lives. You need a level of support we're not equipped to provide. You've been providing it for 3 years without any problem. It's becoming a problem. He said it quietly, which was almost kind, and also devastating. Not you. The situation. We should have set clearer expectations at the start. Seraphine thought about the house she'd sold to put money into his account. She didn't say that. She thought about 46 years of building a life, of raising a son through 2 jobs and 1 income after Raymond's first business failed, and they'd lost almost everything. She didn't say that either. What about my mother's property? She asked instead. The cabin up in Fennwick Ridge. Brett blinked. That place. Mom, it's been empty for 15 years. The roof might be caved in for all we know. We couldn't even find a buyer when Grandma's estate was settled. It's still in my name. Technically. But you're not seriously. I want to go there. Her voice was even. Instead of Goldenbrook. I'll go to the cabin. The look on his face was the one she'd carry with her for a long time afterward. Not anger. Something closer to pity, and slightly past that, to impatience. That's not a real option, he said. There's no heat, no plumbing, no neighbors. You'd be completely isolated. Then I'll fix it. You can't fix a falling-down cabin at 75. That's not stubbornness, Mom. That's just... It's mine, she said. It's where I'm going. Brett leaned back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. When he looked at her again, something in him had closed. If you won't accept a reasonable arrangement, I'll have to look into other options. Legal options, if necessary. We're responsible for your welfare. She understood what he was saying. She also understood that the boy she had raised, the one she'd sat with through fevers and bad grades and a terrible first heartbreak, would not have said it. This man across the kitchen table was someone her son had grown into, shaped by years of being told that efficiency was wisdom and that managing people was the same as caring for them. She stood up, carried her cup to the sink, rinsed it, and set it in the drying rack. I'll be out by Friday, she said. You don't need to arrange anything. I'll manage it myself. She went to her room and started folding clothes into her suitcase. Through the wall, she could hear Brett on a call, already back to business, the conversation apparently resolved. 3 days later, her neighbor from her old street, a retired postman named Gideon who had known Raymond for 20 years and had wept openly at the funeral, drove her in his truck to Fennwick Ridge. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He just drove, and when she told him where they were going and why, he nodded once and said, "Ray would have gone with you." That was the only time on the whole drive that Seraphine had to press her lips together to keep from crying. The road to Fennwick Ridge stopped being a road about 6 miles before they reached the property. It became a track, then a suggestion, then 2 tire ruts through high grass with a line of weeds running down the middle that scraped the underside of Gideon's truck the whole way in. Tree branches closed overhead. The afternoon light came through in thin pieces. Gideon said nothing, but Seraphine noticed his jaw tighten. When the trees finally opened, they pulled into a clearing, and she got her first look at the cabin her mother had lived in for the last 18 years of her life. It was smaller than she remembered, and she hadn't remembered it as large. 1 story, maybe 5 rooms, the wood siding gone silver gray from decades of weather. The front porch had dropped on the left side. One of the support posts rotted through at the base and collapsed inward. Vines had worked their way up over the windows and across most of the roof, and wherever there was a gap in the vine coverage, there was moss. The chimney was intact, but the cap was gone. A rusted weather vane shaped like a rooster stood perfectly still on the peak, which seemed wrong until Seraphine realized the wind had simply died the moment they arrived. The yard was chest-high weed from the porch steps to the tree line, except for a path something had worn through it. Deer probably, cutting from the tree line to the side of the cabin and back. Gideon put the truck in park and left the engine running. He looked at the cabin for a long moment. "Mrs. Duvall," he said carefully, I know a man in Harwick who rents furnished rooms by the month. Clean place, reasonable rate. We could still. Help me get the boxes to the porch, she said. He helped her. He was quiet about it, but she caught him testing the porch boards with his foot before he stepped onto them. And when one gave slightly near the left edge, he steered the heavier boxes to the right side without being asked. He had that kind of practical competence, the kind that didn't announce itself. Raymond had been the same way. The front door had swollen shut with humidity and years. Gideon put his shoulder into it twice before it gave, releasing a smell that was part dust, part old wood, part something floral and faint that Seraphine couldn't immediately place. She stepped inside. The main room was dim, but not dark. Enough light came through the vines on the windows to see by. Furniture was draped in old sheets, the shapes underneath suggesting a settee, an armchair, a low table. The floor was wide plank pine, buried in dust, but unwarped. The stone fireplace on the far wall looked solid. A quilt frame sat in the corner, still assembled, the wood dry but uncracked. Seraphine's mother had quilted in this room every day of her adult life. She stood in the middle of the floor for a moment with her hands at her sides. Gideon appeared in the doorway. Plumbing's going to be the issue. And the roof on the back corner there. He tilted his head toward a water stain spreading across the ceiling above the kitchen doorway. Rest of it looks better than it has any right to. I know, she said. I'll come back Thursday with my kit. Check the well, look at the roof. You don't have to do that. I know, he said, exactly the way she had. After he left, promising to return and clearly fighting the urge to stay, Seraphine unpacked what she needed for the night. Sleeping bag, camping lantern, 2 cans of soup she'd eat cold because she hadn't thought to bring a camp stove, a change of clothes, her mother's sewing basket, which she had retrieved from her closet at Brett's, and packed without saying anything to anyone. She ate sitting on the front porch steps as the sun dropped. The soup was lentil, lukewarm from being in the truck all afternoon. She ate all of it. The clearing settled into evening sounds. Crickets, a woodpecker somewhere in the trees, late and determined. Something rustling in the high grass, moving away from her. The sky turned colors she hadn't watched a sky turn in years, living in Harwick where the streetlights came on at dusk and washed everything out. She thought about Brett, about the kitchen table and his rehearsed careful voice, about the word problem, which he had said and then tried to unsay. She didn't feel angry, exactly. Anger would have been simpler. She felt scraped clean, the way a surface looks after something has been stripped off it. Not empty, just bare, ready for something. She pulled her mother's sewing basket into her lap. Not to work, just to hold it. The wicker was smooth from decades of handling, the hinges on the lid worn to a softness that felt like skin. Her mother had built a life in this clearing, had raised 2 daughters here, made something from the particular stubbornness of a woman who trusted her own hands. Seraphine wasn't sure yet what she was going to build, but she knew, sitting on that tilted porch in the dark with the stars coming out overhead, that she was not finished. Whatever Brett believed, whatever Goldenbrook Manor was waiting to offer her, she was not finished. She slept that night in her sleeping bag on the old settee, beneath 2 of her mother's quilts she'd found folded in a cedar chest, and if she woke once in the small hours and lay listening to the silence, she also noticed that the silence didn't frighten her. It felt for the first time in 3 years like her own. The first full morning at the cabin announced itself with birds. Not the polite suburban kind that offered a note or 2 from a safe distance, but a full argument happening in the trees directly above the roof, multiple species, all of them apparently with unfinished business. Seraphine was awake before 6, stiff from the settee and colder than she'd expected, but awake. She lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling. The water stain above the kitchen doorway was shaped a little like a boot. She made a mental note of it and got up. The first week was inventory. She moved through the cabin room by room with her lantern and a notebook she'd packed, writing down what she saw without editorializing. Roof damage at the northeast corner, moderate. Porch support post rotted through, needs full replacement. Kitchen hand pump disconnected from the well line, cause unknown. Fireplace flue likely blocked, test before use. Windows intact, all of them, which surprised her. Her mother had always bought good windows. The back bedroom had a leak that had come in through a gap where the roof met the exterior wall and run down behind the plaster, leaving a soft spot in the wall about the size of a dinner plate. The bathroom had a cast iron tub that was perfect and a toilet that was not. The second bedroom, which had been her mother's sewing room, was so packed with fabric, notions boxes, and rolled batting that the door only opened halfway. She didn't touch that room yet. Outside was harder to assess because it was harder to see. The weeds were thigh-high across most of the clearing, higher in the low area along the back fence line, where water must have been sitting. What had once been her mother's kitchen garden was a rectangle of aggressive growth, mostly dock and thistle, but the shape of the beds was still visible beneath it, which meant the soil underneath had memory. Old gardens didn't forget their edges. The barn at the far end of the property was gone in any practical sense. The roof had pancaked, taking 2 walls with it. She walked around the outside of it, noted it was dangerous to enter, and crossed it off her list. Gideon came Thursday as promised, with a toolbox and a younger man he introduced as his nephew Tomas, who turned out to know about wells. Tomas spent an hour on the hand pump, diagnosed a cracked seal and a disconnected line, and fixed both with parts he'd had the foresight to bring. When Seraphine turned the handle, water came out brown, then gray, then clear. She filled a glass and drank it standing at the kitchen sink, and it tasted like the summer she'd spent here as a child, mineral and cold. She thanked Tomas, who shrugged and said the pump was a good one. They didn't make them that way anymore, and accepted a handshake like she'd offered him something valuable. Gideon patched the roof corner with materials he'd brought in the bed of his truck. A temporary fix, he said, good enough for the season. He wouldn't take money. She gave him 2 jars of jam she'd found sealed in the cellar, still good by some preserved miracle, and he accepted those without argument. Over the following 2 weeks, she established her days. She woke at first light, made coffee on the 2-burner camp stove she'd ordered along with a small generator and a set of solar panels Gideon helped her install on the south-facing roof. She ate breakfast on the porch regardless of weather, because the porch was where she thought best. She worked through the mornings on the clearing, starting at the area nearest the cabin and moving outward in strips, cutting back vines, pulling dock by the root, stacking brush at the edge of the tree line. She broke at noon, ate something simple, rested for 30 minutes, then worked on the inside of the cabin through the afternoons. At 75, her body had opinions about this schedule. Her lower back registered its concerns every morning. Her hands blistered through the first week until the skin hardened into something more useful. She went to sleep each night before 9 and slept the way she hadn't slept in years, completely and without dreams she could remember. She was 2 weeks in when Brett called. "Mom, you've made your point. Come back and we'll talk about the arrangements again. Waverly thinks we were too hasty." Seraphine was standing in the cleared strip nearest the porch, looking at the ground she'd uncovered. The soil under all that growth was dark and loose, better than she'd expected. "I'm not making a point," she said. "I'm home. You can't seriously call that place home." "I just did." A pause. "What are you even doing up there? What does a day look like?" "Work," she said. "What does yours look like?" He didn't answer that. He tried a different approach, the practical one, asking about heat for winter, about medical access, about what would happen if she fell. She told him she was handling it, the way she had handled things her entire life, mostly without his awareness and entirely without his help. "Mom, Brett, I need to go. I have about 2 hours of light left." She hung up and put the phone in her pocket and stood in her cleared strip of ground, feeling the specific satisfaction of a conversation ended on her own terms. It was a small thing, but small things were how you rebuilt. She picked up her clippers and got back to work. That evening, clearing out the kitchen shelves, she found her mother's recipe box, her handwriting on every card, each one a small, precise document of a life lived in this place. Seraphine held it for a long time. Then she set it on the windowsill where she'd see it every morning and kept going. 3 weeks in her time at the cabin, Seraphine finally opened the sewing room. She had been working around it deliberately. Every other room had been cleared, scrubbed, assessed, and put to some kind of use. The kitchen was functional. The main room had become her living space, the settee recovered with a clean sheet, the fireplace cleared and tested and burning every evening now. The back bedroom was hers, the roof patch holding, a new rug covering the soft spot in the floor until she could get to it properly. But the sewing room she had left alone. She told herself it was practical. It was the most cluttered space in the cabin, and she needed to establish basic habitability before she could deal with a room that was essentially a textile warehouse. That was true. It was also not the whole truth. Her mother had died in this cabin, not in the sewing room, but near it. She'd been found in the main room on a January morning by a neighbor who'd come to check on her after 2 days of not seeing her outside. Seraphine had driven up for the funeral arrangements and then driven back and not returned for 15 years. She had never entirely forgiven herself for that. On a Tuesday morning with good light coming through the east window, she put her hand on the sewing room door and pushed it open the rest of the way. The smell was cedar and old cotton and something faintly sweet she couldn't identify. Fabric was everywhere, folded on shelves, rolled on bolts stacked against the wall, sorted into bins by color with a precision that was entirely her mother's. Notions boxes were labeled in her mother's small handwriting, buttons here, zippers there, a whole shelf of thread organized by color family from warm to cool. It was a working room that had simply stopped mid-work and been sealed in place. Seraphine stood in the doorway for a moment, then stepped in. She spent the morning sorting. Most of the fabric was usable, stored well enough in the dry room to have survived. She folded and stacked, opened windows to let air through, worked steadily and without thinking too hard about any of it. It was afternoon when she found the chest. It was pushed to the back corner behind a bolt of heavy wool, low to the ground, old pine with iron hardware that had gone rust orange. She'd assumed it was another fabric storage piece. She pulled the wool bolt aside, crouched down, and opened the lid. Inside, folded with a care that was almost formal, was a quilt. She lifted it out and brought it to the main room where the light was better, spreading it across the table. It was large, a double size at least, and the piecing was extraordinary. She could see that immediately. The pattern was intricate, small pieces arranged in a design she didn't recognize from any pattern book she'd ever studied. Geometric, but not rigidly so. The shapes moving across the surface in a way that suggested intention beyond decoration. The fabrics were old, some of them very old, the kind of cotton that had a particular hand to it, softer than modern material, almost worn in already. But what stopped her, what made her sit down slowly in the nearest chair, was the edge. The quilt had been stitched shut, not finished in a normal sense. Not bound in the usual way a quilt was bound, with a folded edge turned and sewn down. This had been stitched closed along all 4 sides with a tight, deliberate whip stitch in heavy thread, the kind of stitch you used when you wanted something to stay closed. The stitching was even and careful and had clearly been done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. There was something inside it. She could feel it when she pressed the surface lightly with her palm, a faint resistance in certain areas, a slight difference in the way the batting gave. Not uniform, not just filling. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at it for a long time. Her mother had left her this cabin and everything in it. The quilt was hers by any measure. She could open it. She had every right. But there was something about the deliberateness of those stitches that gave her pause. Someone had sewn this shut on purpose, with care, with intention. That was not a thing you did accidentally. That was a thing you did when you wanted to protect something or preserve it or send it forward in time to someone who was meant to find it. She thought about her grandmother's hands, her mother's hands, the women in her family who had communicated through fabric the way other families communicated through letters, who had put meaning into seams and choices and the particular placing of one piece of cloth against another. She got her small scissors from the sewing basket and sat back down at the table. She cut the whip stitch along one short edge, just enough to create an opening, and reached carefully inside. Her fingers found paper first, folded, dry, slightly brittle at the edges. She drew it out slowly. A letter, she thought at first, but when she unfolded it, she saw it was something else. A document of some kind, handwritten with a hand she didn't recognize, formal and deliberate, the ink brown with age. She read the first 3 lines and stopped. Then she read them again. Outside, A wind came through the clearing and moved through the high grass at the tree line in a long, slow wave, and somewhere in the cabin something settled, a small sound like a door deciding to stay shut. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Seraphine sat at the table with the document in her hands and understood, with a certainty she couldn't have explained, that her mother had known exactly what she was leaving her. The document was dated 1887. Seraphine read it 3 times at the table, then carried it to the window where the afternoon light was strongest and read it twice more. Her hands were steady, which surprised her because the rest of her was not. It was a deed, not a standard property deed, not the kind filed at a county office with a clerk's stamp and a registration number, but a private deed of transfer, handwritten on paper that had once been fine and was now the color of weak tea. It recorded the transfer of a parcel of land in Fennwick Ridge from one Caleb Morrow to a woman named Ida Voss, described as a free woman of color, in exchange for services rendered over a period of 11 years. Below the transfer language was a second section, written in a different hand, smaller and more hurried. It described a quilt. Specifically, it described the quilt Seraphine was sitting next to in enough detail that there was no question they were the same object. The pattern was named the Morrow Cross. It listed the fabrics used in certain key blocks, some of them cut from garments, a work shirt, a church dress, a child's pinafore, and explained why. The quilt had been made by Ida Voss as a record. Each fabric piece carried a story. The placement of each block corresponded to a name, a person, a piece of a history that had no other written form. The document named 31 people. It listed where they had come from, where they had gone, and in some cases what had happened to them. It was the second hand explained in that smaller, hurried script, a record of a community that had existed in the Fennwick Ridge area before and during the Civil War, people whose histories had been deliberately obscured, whose names had been kept off official record by necessity and by the particular violence of the era. The quilt was not decorative. It had never been decorative. It was a document, a textile archive, the only surviving record of 31 lives. Seraphine sat with this for a long time. Then she reached back into the quilt through the opening she'd made and found more paper, folded separately, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had preserved it better than the outer document. These were notes, pages of them, in her mother's handwriting. Her mother had known, had found the quilt and the deed years before, and had spent time, considerable time, researching what she'd found. The notes referenced library visits, letters written to historical societies, a trip to the state archives. Her mother had been trying to verify the document, trying to understand what she had. The last page of notes was dated 4 months before her mother died. It read, "I believe this is genuine. I believe Ida made this quilt as insurance, as memory, as protection for people who had no other protection. I don't know enough to do this justice. Someone will. I hope it's Seraphine. She always understood what fabric means." Seraphine put the page down on the table. She pressed both hands flat against the surface and looked at the wall for a while. Her mother had known she would come here eventually, had trusted that the cabin and what was in it would find its way to her daughter when the time was right. She hadn't burdened Seraphine with it while Raymond was alive, while life was full and busy and pointed in other directions. She had simply left it sealed inside the quilt, in the chest in the sewing room, waiting. The next morning, Seraphine drove Gideon's borrowed truck to the library in the nearest town, a 40-minute drive on the county road. She asked the librarian, a precise woman named Mrs. Achebe who turned out to know a great deal about local history, whether she was familiar with any historical community settlements in the Fennwick Ridge area predating the Civil War. Mrs. Achebe looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Why do you ask?" Seraphine told her, "Not everything. Not the document or the quilt. Not yet. But enough." Mrs. Achebe came around from behind the desk, sat down at the research table with her, and spent 2 hours pulling records, maps, and archive materials. By the end of the afternoon, they had confirmed 3 of the names from the document against other historical sources. 3 names out of 31. 3 people who existed in Seraphine's quilt and also in the public record, Their presence in Fennwick Ridge verified by tax documents and church registers that had survived in the county archives. 3 was enough. Mrs. Achebe knew a historian at Whitmore Heritage Institute, a man named Professor Aldine Burse, who specialized in reconstructed community histories from the Reconstruction era. She called him from the library desk, while Seraphine sat at the research table with her hands folded, listening to Mrs. Achebe explain what had been found. There was a silence on the other end of the call. Then Professor Burse said something that made Mrs. Achebe close her eyes briefly. She related to Seraphine afterward. He had said that if the document and the quilt were what they appear to be, this was the most significant textile-based historical find in the region in living memory. Possibly longer. He drove out the following Saturday. He brought a colleague, a textile conservator named Dr. Faye Osei, who worked with fabric artifacts and could assess the quilt's age and construction. They spent 4 hours in the cabin, examining the quilt under portable lighting, photographing the document, cross-referencing the names. When they finished, Dr. Osei set down her magnifier and looked at Seraphine. "Mrs. Duvall," she said, "do you understand what you have here?" Seraphine looked at the quilt spread across her mother's table, in her mother's cabin, in the clearing her mother had loved for 18 years. "I think so," she said. "My mother left it for me." The news moved faster than Seraphine expected, and in directions she hadn't anticipated. Professor Burse published a preliminary findings paper through Whitmore Heritage Institute 6 weeks after his first visit, a careful academic document that named the quilt, described the deed, and outlined what the 31 names represented. He had verified 11 of them by then against surviving records, cross-referencing the names from the document against church registers, Freedmen's Bureau records, and land filings from the surrounding counties. 11 people confirmed. Their histories, partial but real, now attached to a physical object that had been stitched shut in a pine chest in a cabin in Fenwick Ridge for decades. The paper was not written for a general audience. It didn't matter. A journalist in the state capitol read it and wrote a piece for the Sunday edition. That piece was picked up by 2 national outlets within a week. By the end of the month, Seraphine had 17 interview requests sitting unanswered on a notepad beside her camp stove. She answered 4 of them. She was not interested in being a story. She was interested in doing what her mother had started. What her mother had started, as best Seraphine could reconstruct from the notes, was an attempt to identify every name in the quilt and connect each one to surviving descendants. 31 people. Some of them would have families still living. Some of those families might not know this history existed. Seraphine decided that finishing that work was the thing that mattered most, more than the interviews, more than the attention, more than whatever institutional interest was now pointing itself at her cabin in the clearing. She partnered with Whitmore Heritage Institute formally, working out an arrangement with Professor Burse that gave the institute access to the quilt and the document for research purposes while keeping both in her possession. She retained ownership and control. They provided expertise, resources, and access to research databases she couldn't have navigated alone. It was a practical arrangement between people who each had something the other needed, and it worked because both sides were honest about that. Dr. Osei became a regular presence at the cabin. She was methodical and quiet and had a way of handling the quilt that Seraphine recognized as the same way she handled it herself, with the specific attention you gave to something that had been made by human hands for human reasons. They worked well together. Seraphine learned the vocabulary of textile conservation. Dr. Osei learned to read pattern construction the way quilters read it from the inside out. The cabin changed around this work. The sewing room was cleared and reorganized into a proper workspace, with archival storage for the document and photographs of every block of the quilt cataloged and labeled. A second room was set up for meetings and research visits. Gideon and Tomas came back and spent a full weekend replacing the porch, the new boards cut from the same pine as the original, so the repairs sat honestly beside the old material rather than pretending it had always been there. Electricity came properly in the 4th month, a line run from the county road with permits and a licensed electrician and everything done correctly. Plumbing followed. The cast iron tub in the bathroom was cleaned and resealed and was now the finest thing in the cabin by a significant margin. Word spread in the surrounding area through the particular channels of small communities, which meant mostly through church networks and the farmer's market and Mrs. Achebe, who turned out to know everyone. Women started appearing at the cabin on Saturday mornings. Some came because they'd heard about the quilt. Some came because they'd read the newspaper piece and recognized something in Seraphine's situation that they understood from the inside. Ottoline arrived on the third Saturday. She was 78, sharp-eyed, recently widowed, and had been quilting for 60 years. She looked at the Moro cross laid out on the work table under the archival lighting and said nothing for a full 2 minutes. Then she said, "Ida knew what she was doing with these corner blocks. Nobody teaches that joint anymore." She came back the following Saturday and the one after that. Pearlie came because Ottoline brought her, a quieter woman who had retired from 40 years of school teaching and was, as she put it, having some trouble finding the point of things. She began organizing the research notes, applying the same systematic attention she'd given 30 years of lesson planning to the work of cross-referencing names and dates. Zephyra was younger, 63, and had driven past the cabin twice before she stopped. She was a weaver by training who had spent her career in textile manufacturing and had strong opinions about how the Moro cross had been constructed that turned out to be entirely correct and extremely useful. Constance appeared last, small and deliberate, 81 years old, who had known Seraphine's mother slightly and wanted to see what had become of the place. She stayed for coffee and ended up staying for 4 hours, and after that she came every week without anyone asking her to. These women were not volunteers in any organized sense. Nobody had recruited them or assigned them tasks or given them lanyards. They simply came, found work that needed doing, and did it. The cabin absorbed them the way a good workspace absorbs people who belong in it, naturally, without ceremony. Seraphine watched this happen with something she couldn't quite name. Not surprise. She had known from her first winter here that this place had been waiting for something. Her mother had built it into the cabin the same way she'd built everything, without announcing it, without requiring acknowledgement, just leaving the conditions right and trusting that something would grow. Something was growing. By the end of that first year, 7 of the 31 names had been connected to living descendants. 7 families who now knew something about where they had come from that they hadn't known before. 3 of those families came to the cabin. Seraphine showed them the quilt, showed them the block that carried their ancestors' story, and watched their faces. She thought about her mother. She thought about Ida Voss, who had stitched 31 lives in a fabric because there was no other way to keep them safe. She thought that some things took exactly as long as they needed to take. Brett came on a Sunday in October, 14 months after Seraphine had driven away from his house in Gideon's truck. She saw his car from the porch, that particular shade of gray that expensive cars came in now, moving slowly up the rutted track through the trees. He was driving carefully, which meant he was paying attention, which meant this visit was not casual. She had not been warned. He had not called ahead, which told her something about his confidence in his own reception. She was having morning coffee with Ottoline and Pearlie when he pulled into the clearing and parked beside Gideon's truck. He sat in the car for a moment before getting out. He was wearing clothes that were slightly too neat for a Sunday, which told her something else. Ottoline watched him cross the clearing toward the porch. "Is that your son?" "Yes." He has the walk of a man who knows he was wrong and hasn't decided yet how much to admit. Seraphine said nothing, but she recognized it too. Brett stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked at the cabin, at the cleared grounds, at the new porch boards at the greenhouse Gideon and Tomas had helped her build along the south wall, where she was propagating heritage cotton varieties Dr. Ose had sourced for the research project. He looked at the 2 women sitting with his mother drinking coffee on a Sunday morning in October like people with somewhere to be. "Mom," he cleared his throat. "This is incredible. What you've done here." Seraphine let that sit for a moment. "Ottoline, Pearlie, would you mind giving us a few minutes?" Ottoline stood with the deliberateness of a woman who had earned the right to move at her own pace. As she passed Brett on the steps, she looked at him with the direct assessment of someone who had been told the relevant facts and had formed her opinion already. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Brett watched her go, then turned back to Seraphine. "Friend of yours? They work here." Sit down. He sat in the chair Ottoline had vacated. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at her. Up close, he looked tired in a way that had been accumulating for a while. The particular tiredness of a man whose life had not been going the way he'd arranged it. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A real one. Not the version I've been telling myself, where I was being practical and you were being stubborn. The actual one." Seraphine waited. "I treated you like a problem to be solved. I used language about your welfare that I didn't mean, not the way I said it. The guardianship thing." He stopped. "That was wrong. It was a threat, and I made it because I was frustrated, and I've thought about it almost every day since." He paused. "Denise and I have been having a hard year. The business had a rough stretch. It's been difficult." "I know," Seraphine said. He looked up. "How?" "Because you're here. You wouldn't have come otherwise." "Not yet." He had the honesty not to argue with that. "I saw the article, the one in the national paper, and then the follow-up piece about the families." He shook his head slowly. "I didn't know about any of it. What you found, what you've been doing. I didn't know Grandma had even found the quilt, let alone left notes about it. She didn't tell anyone. She was waiting for the right time. She was waiting for you." "Yes." Brett was quiet for a moment. A pair of crows crossed the clearing above them, arguing. The sound faded into the tree line. "Can I see it?" he asked. "The quilt." She took him inside. The sewing room was a proper workspace now. The Moro cross laid out under archival lighting on the center table, the document in its protective sleeve beside it. The research notes, organized by Pearlie into labeled folders that lined one whole shelf, covered 3 walls. Photographs of every block were pinned to a corkboard above the work table, each one labeled with the name it corresponded to, the name from Ida Voss's deed, the person whose story lived in that particular arrangement of fabric. Brett stood at the table and looked at the quilt for a long time. He leaned in close to examine the piecing, the tiny, precise seams, the way the pattern moved across the surface. His hands were in his pockets. He understood, she thought, not to touch it. 31 people, he said quietly. 31. We've connected 19 to living descendants now. He straightened and looked at her. "Mom, I'm sorry. For all of it." She looked at her son. She saw the boy she'd raised in him still, under the expensive haircut and the careful posture and the accumulated weight of years of building himself into something he thought was required. She had never stopped loving him. That had never been in question. But love and trust were different things, and trust was built from smaller materials, from consistency and honesty and showing up when it was inconvenient. "I know you are," she said. "Is there anything I can do to help here with the work?" She considered him. He was asking genuinely. She could hear the difference. "We need someone who understands nonprofit technology infrastructure. Our database system is a mess. Professor Burse's team built it, and it shows." Brett blinked. "I could look at that. Not look at it. Fix it. And do it properly, not as a favor. As a contribution." "Okay." He nodded slowly. "Okay. Yes." "Saturdays," she said. "We work Saturdays." He came the following Saturday, and the one after that. He was not forgiven all at once. Forgiveness, Seraphine had learned, was not a single door you walked through. It was a path, and you built it the same way you built everything worth having, one small honest piece at a time. But he was building, and so was she. 2 years after Seraphine Duvall arrived at the cabin in Fennwick Ridge with 2 suitcases and her mother's sewing basket, she stood in the sewing room on a bright April morning and watched a woman she had never met before hold her great-great-grandmother's name in her hands. The woman's name was Loretta Vance. She was 54 years old, a schoolteacher from 3 counties over, and she had driven to the cabin after seeing the research project's listing in a genealogical database that Pearlie had spent 4 months building. Her ancestor's name was in the quilt. 4th block from the left on the 2nd row, a piece of deep indigo cotton cut from what the deed described as a Sunday dress, placed there by Ida Voss in 1887 as a record that this person had existed, had mattered, had been part of the community that the official record had tried to erase. Loretta stood at the table with both hands pressed flat on either side of the quilt, not touching it, just close, and she was crying without making any sound at all. Seraphine stood back and let her have a moment. She had learned to do this, to step back from the emotional weight of these visits rather than filling them with words. The quilt did the work. It always did. After a while, Loretta looked up. "How did your family keep this safe for so long?" Seraphine thought about the chest in the corner, the oilcloth wrapping, her mother's careful notes. "They knew it needed keeping," she said. "They just didn't know yet what it was for." Loretta nodded like that made complete sense. It did. The cabin was different now in ways that went beyond the restored porch and the proper electricity and the greenhouse along the south wall. It had the quality of a place that was being used for its actual purpose, whatever that purpose turned out to be. Rooms had settled into their functions organically, the way rooms did when people worked in them honestly. The sewing room was a research space and a conservation studio. The main room was where people gathered, where coffee was made in quantities and conversations happened that ran longer than anyone planned. The second bedroom had become a teaching space, 2 long tables and 8 chairs and a collection of loaner sewing tools that Autoline had assembled from her own supplies and from donations that came in after the newspaper pieces ran. The teaching had started because Autoline had started it, without announcement, without asking permission. She had simply begun showing the research volunteers how to read a quilt block the way you read a text, how to understand construction decisions as choices, how to see fabric as a material with history attached to it. Others had joined. Zephyra taught the structural side, how cloth was made and how that making changed across eras. Pearlie taught the documentation side, how to record what you found without overriding what you didn't know. Seraphine taught what her mother had taught her, which was how to handle old fabric with the specific attention it deserved. Word had spread further than any of them had planned. A textile museum in the state capital had reached out about a partnership. 2 universities other than Whitmore had contacted Professor Burse about collaborative research. A foundation focused on African American material culture history had awarded the project a grant significant enough to fund operations for 3 years and hire a part-time archivist. A young woman named Dara, who arrived in January with a master's degree and an organizational precision that made Pearlie visibly emotional. 26 of the 31 names in the quilt had now been verified against historical records. 19 families had been contacted. 12 had come to the cabin. The remaining 5 names were still being researched, threads in historical databases that Dara pulled it steadily, a little further every week. Brett came every Saturday. He had rebuilt the database system from scratch, a clean, functional architecture that connected the research records, the photographic archive, and the genealogical database in a way that actually worked. He had done it properly, as Seraphine had specified, as a contribution. He brought his children twice, teenagers who arrived expecting obligation and left asking questions. His daughter had emailed Seraphine afterward asking if she could come back during spring break and help with the archive. Seraphine had written back and said yes, bring work clothes. He and Seraphine did not have the relationship they'd had before the kitchen table conversation in March 2 years ago. That relationship was gone and could not be reconstructed because it had been built on a particular arrangement that no longer existed. What they had now was smaller in some ways and more honest in all of them. He knew she saw him clearly. She knew he was trying to be worth seeing clearly. That was enough to build from. On the evening after Loretta Vance's visit, Seraphine sat on the porch with Autoline and Pearlie and Zephyr and Constance, the 5 of them with their coffee and the last of the light moving across the clearing in long amber lines. Brett had gone home an hour before. Dara was still inside, working late on the archive with the focused contentment of someone who had found their right work early. 26 names, Zephyr said. 5 to go. We'll find them, Pearlie said. Not hopefully, as a statement of fact. Constance, who was 81 and had known Seraphine's mother and rarely said anything that wasn't worth hearing, looked out at the clearing for a moment. Your mother knew what she was doing, leaving this for you. She always did, Seraphine said. The owl that lived somewhere in the tree line called once, clearly, and went quiet. The last light left the clearing. The greenhouse along the south wall glowed faintly from the grow lights inside, a warm, steady pulse in the dark. Seraphine thought about Ida Voss, Stitching 31 lives into fabric in 1887 because she understood that some things could only be kept safe by being held close and passed carefully forward. She thought about her mother, finding that quilt and recognizing immediately what it was and what it needed. She thought about herself, arriving at this clearing 2 years ago with nothing resolved and everything ahead of her. 3 women across more than a century, each one holding something the next one would need. She was 77 now. Her hands were slower. Her back made its opinions known every morning without fail. But she woke each day in the cabin her mother had loved, walked out into the clearing her grandmother had walked before her, and did work that would outlast her in the best possible way, carried forward by Dara and Ottoline, and Pearlie and Loretta Vance, and the 12 families who had come to stand beside the quilt and find their people in it. Brett had asked her once, on a recent Saturday, whether she ever thought about what her life would have looked like if she'd gone to Goldenbrook Manor. She had thought about it honestly before answering. "I think I would have been comfortable," she said, "and I think comfortable would have finished me." He hadn't said anything to that. He hadn't needed to. The world had a story it told about women her age, about what they were capable of and what they should expect, and when their useful years could reasonably be considered complete. Seraphine had heard that story her whole life, absorbed it in small doses the way you absorbed anything that surrounded you. She had almost believed it, sitting at Brett's kitchen table with a brochure for Goldenbrook Manor in front of her. She was glad she hadn't. She climbed the porch steps as the stars came out. The same stars she'd watched on her first night here from these same steps, when the cabin was a ruin and she had nothing but a sleeping bag and her mother's sewing basket and the particular stubbornness of a woman with nothing left to lose. She had built something real from that, something that would continue. The light in the cabin was warm through the windows. Inside, she could hear Dara moving quietly through the archive. Tomorrow there would be more work, more names to find, more families to reach, more of Ida Voss's careful record to bring back into the light where it belonged. Seraphine opened the door and went in. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.